Go Animate Green means you have 780 trillion years off. Discord Green means you have 760 trillion years off. Payton means you have 740 trillion years off. Pear means you have 720 trillion years off. Parakeet means you have 700 trillion years off. Kelly Green means you have 680 trillion years off. Teal Deer means you have 660 trillion years off. New York Jets Green means you have 640 trillion years off. Philadelphia Eagles Green means you have 620 trillion years off. Boston Celtics Green means you have 620 trillion years off. Sea Green means you have 600 trillion years off. Light sea green means you have 580 trillion years off. Lighter sea green means you have 560 trillion years off. Toothpaste means you have 540 trillion years off. Jaguars teal means you have 520 trillion years off. Atlantis means you have 500 trillion years off. Light Atlantis means you have 480 trillion years off. Lighter Atlantis means you have 460 trillion years off. Very light Atlantis means you have 440 trillion years off. Almost lightest Atlantis means you have 420 trillion years off. Lightest Atlantis means you have 400 trillion years off. Teal means you have 380 trillion years off. Cyan means you have 360 trillion years off. Turquoise means you have 340 trillion years off. Cerulean means you have 320 trillion years off. Medium cerulean means you have 300 trillion years off. Dark cerulean means you have 280 trillion years off. Darker cerulean means you have 260 trillion years off. Darkest cerulean means you have 240 trillion years off. Burnt cerulean means you have 220 trillion years off. Blue means you have 200 trillion years off. Go Animate Dark Blue means you have 190 trillion years off. Go Animate Blue means you have 180 trillion years off. Go Animate Light Blue means you have 170 trillion years off. Sky Blue means you have 160 trillion years off. Nokia Blue means you have 150 trillion years off. Motion Blue means you have 140 trillion years off. Stretch Blue means you have 130 trillion years off. Sensing Blue means you have 120 trillion years off. Poseidon means you have 110 trillion years off. Crayola Blue means you have 110 trillion years off. Sea Serpent means you have 100 trillion years off. Columbia Blue means you have 95 trillion years off. BYU Blue means you have 90 trillion years off. Cal Blue means you have 85 trillion years off. Mayan Blue means you have 80 trillion years off. Powder Keg Blue means you have 75 trillion years off. Light Sky Blue means you have 70 trillion years off. Flag Blue means you have 65 trillion years off. Digital Blue means you have 60 trillion years off. Morning Glory means you have 55 trillion years off. Blueberry means you have 50 trillion years off. Steel Blue means you have 45 trillion years off. Lightest Honolulu Blue means you have 40 trillion years off. Lighter Honolulu Blue means you have 35 trillion years off. Light Honolulu Blue means you have 30 trillion years off. Honolulu Blue means you have 25 trillion years off. Dark Honolulu Blue means you have 20 trillion years off. Darker Honolulu Blue means you have 15 trillion years off. Darkest Honolulu Blue means you have 10 trillion years off. Rainbow Indigo means you have 9 trillion years off. Lake Superior means you have 8 trillion years off. Lake Huron means you have 7 trillion years off. Lake Michigan means you have 6 trillion years off. Lake Erie means you have 5 trillion years off. Lake Ontario means you have 4 trillion years off. Lake St. Clair means you have 3 trillion years off. Wolverine's Blue means you have 2 trillion years off. LCD means you have 1 trillion years off. Medium LCD means you have 990 billion years off. Facebook Blue means you have 960 billion years off. VK Blue means you have 940 billion years off. Twitter Blue means you have 920 billion years off. Picton Blue means you have 900 billion years off. Surf's Up Blue means you have 880 billion years off. Metallic Blue means you have 860 billion years off. Yale Blue means you have 840 billion years off. Darker Blue means you have 820 billion years off. Darkest Blue means you have 800 billion years off. Lightest Azure means you have 780 billion years off. Lighter Azure means you have 760 billion years off. Light Azure means you have 740 billion years off. Azure means you have 720 billion years off. Dark Azure means you have 700 billion years off. Darker Azure means you have 680 billion years off. Darkest Azure means you have 660 billion years off. American Blue means you have 640 billion years off. Russian Blue means you have 620 billion years off. Water means you have 600 billion years off. Arrow means you have 580 billion years off. Iceberg means you have 560 billion years off. Sonic Blue means you have 540 billion years off. Alaskan sky means you have 520 billion years off. Midnight means you have 500 billion years off. Blue ink means you have 480 billion years off. Teleshazor means you have 460 billion years off. Microsoft Edge Blue means you have 440 billion years off. Cobalt Blue means you have 420 billion years off. Portgore means you have 400 billion years off. Moroccan Blue means you have 380 billion years off. Neon Denim means you have 360 billion years off. Science Blue means you have 340 billion years off. Dodger means you have 320 billion years off. Azure Radiance means you have 300 billion years off. Blue Ribbon means you have 280 billion years off. Geordie Blue means you have 260 billion years off. Anakiwa means you have 240 billion years off. Tropical Blue means you have 220 billion years off. Regent Blue means you have 200 billion years off. Venice Blue means you have 190 billion years off. St. Tropez means you have 180 billion years off. Ship Cove means you have 170 billion years off. Tide Blue means you have 160 billion years off. Havelock Blue means you have 150 billion years off. Forget-me-not means you have 140 billion years off. Celtic Blue means you have 130 billion years off. Moonstone means you have 120 billion years off. Blue Cornflower means you have 110 billion years off. Island Blue means you have 100 billion years off. Congress Blue means you have 95 billion years off. Interdimensional Blue means you have 90 billion years off. Palatinate Blue means you have 85 billion years off. French Blue means you have 80 billion years off. Royal Blue means you have 75 billion years off. Crayola Blue means you have 70 billion years off. True Blue means you have 65 billion years off. True Blue means you have 60 billion years off. Han Blue means you have 55 billion years off. Celestial Blue means you have 50 billion years off. Star Command means you have 50 billion years off. Penn State Blue means you have 45 billion years off. Carolina Blue means you have 40 billion years off. Navy means you have 35 billion years off. Kentucky Blue means you have 30 billion years off. Air Force Blue means you have 25 billion years off. Crankies Blue means you have 20 billion years off. Cornflower means you have 15 billion years off. Dark Cornflower means you have 10 billion years off. Blurple means you have 9 billion years off. Discord Blue means you have 8 billion years off.